This is the multipolar Asia nuclear war simulation. It's based on the rules of the Cold War simulation, nuclear war simulation, and draws a lot of the rules from it. So I'm only going to be discussing the rule differences between the two sims. The essential theoretical objective of the second simulation is to introduce multipolarity and the balance of power dynamics into multiple nuclear confrontations. And so this has some expected effects. The first is that a balance of power situation increases complexity, and therefore we think it could increase escalation. But there's a big debate about whether balance of power creates opportunity for aggression or creates complexity that deters aggression. So it gives an insight into that whole dimension with a nuclear overlay on top of it. In addition to that, we take the players that are the least empathetic and we put them in charge of the states, and then we go in reverse order of ranking, assigning individuals to lead states. So as they are decapitated, we end up with more empathetic, not less empathetic players. So obviously there's an overdetermination problem between testing the two hypotheses, but we with limited time, we try to disentangle the two effects and see what the outcome is. Typically, I like to show that there's so many indeterminate factors in nuclear negotiation, nuclear war, that a single empathy test and the complexity of the balance of power does not necessarily drive escalation up. And you could end up with a much more stable environment in a multipolar nuclear environment than you would in a simple bipolar nuclear environment. So that the turn structure is virtually identical, so I'm not going to cover this. You can just go back and look at the previous Cold War simulation to look at the procedures for that. Same turn sequence of play. There are 8 teams. I've had one simulation for every continent, but the simulation I use the most often is the one in Asia. So you have China, Japan, India, Pakistan, Vietnam, Australia, Thailand, and Indonesia. And unlike the Cold War simulation where they were given weapons, here they're given asset points. And the points can be used to purchase weapons. And so the students have essentially 1 week in which to buy different assets for their country. Then I collect all those assets onto a single email, send it out to all the students, and then they can design their psyops by going off the information provided of the other side's counterforce capabilities. So there's sort of a minimum 2-week lead up to the playing of the simulation. There are additional factors here. Each country is assigned values for launch, collapse, first strike, subs, and long-range sensors. And I'll explain each of those. There's no restriction on who can attack who in the simulation, and there are many different permutations of possible combinations of countries joining together. So that's interesting from the, just from a balance of power point of view, how these interactions play out and how alliances coalesce. So missile defense. Each missile defense point can be used to cancel a single incoming missile or aircraft. Leaders will be asked during an attack whether they want to intercept a given number of inbound missiles. Frequently, I'll simply yell out, there's a missile coming in, do you intercept it? And if the students are not listening, then it impacts. These do not operate voluntarily once 3 decapitations or total collapse has occurred. Missile defense can destroy any target, including aircraft. Missile defense in PSYOPs will operate to destroy all targets until it is exhausted, or it can be turned off in the PSYOP, but not after its initial operation. So some additional rules. Collapsing. Whenever a state has received a number of nuclear hits to counter value equal to its collapse number, it ceases to function. It loses control of all border areas and may no longer launch any missile system, even as part of a PSYOP, unless it has submarines. In effect, these states are more vulnerable than a Cold War biological interaction, and these states, therefore, can completely collapse to the extent that even the PSYOP does not operate. There is a distinction in weapons ranges between short range and long range. Short range weapons can be used against adjacent states, and long range systems can be used against any state anywhere on the map. And this applies both to missiles and to aircraft. Submarines. These are invincible and may be reserved indefinitely, and they can be fired from purgatory. So after a leader's been decapitated, if they're all sitting in the corner, they can still launch their submarines. They simply have to yell across the room. Some countries can have submarines, some cannot. So if we look at the list here, you'll notice that China, Japan, India, and Australia can have submarines, and other states cannot. First strike advantage. Any state that attacks with a first strike advantage has their attacks resolved before any other simultaneous attacks are received, and as if the opponent had not launched their systems. This does not mean one country without first strike cannot attack another. Simultaneous first strike advantages cancel each other out. First strikes apply every turn, not just the first turn. So again, if we look at it, we'll see that Japan and Australia both have the capacity. Perhaps this is a bit dated. China probably has it as well. Long-range sensors. Unless attacks come from an adjacent area or unless a state has a long-range sensor, the state has no idea where the strike came from, and these may not be shared between states. So again, you have China, Japan, and Australia with long-range sensors. Other countries do not. And the way that I resolve it in front of the class, reading out the orders, is I'll simply tell a country, let's say Thailand, that a certain number of nuclear weapons are inbound. Do they want to shoot them down with their missile defense? And otherwise, they have their effect. And I don't tell Thailand where they came from. This is one of the biggest issues with multipolar nuclear wars is some of the medium-sized states can't identify the source of where the missiles come from. And this adds to the complexity. So this is the exchange chart. It is identical to the previous exchange chart in the Cold War simulation. However, at the bottom line, you'll see there's missile defense. It costs 2 per missile. Its range is basically point blank. It's on incoming systems. You can attack it, and it's got the requirement of the different systems to attack it. Now, in addition, there's a column in the center called cost, and those are from the ascent point totals. And so states can purchase weapons on this exchange chart. They can buy missile defense or long-range aircraft or mobile IRBMs and create their own tailor-made arsenal. Now, aircraft losses, short and long-range aircraft suffer losses equal to 50% of the strength of the opponent target rounded up, or the number of targets if dealing with a counter-value target. So if you send them out to blow up 20 cities, they're going to blow up 20 cities, and half the aircraft will come back. Now, I provide a default weapons purchase assignment. This is what the students are going to get if they fail to make weapons purchases. And these are relatively unsophisticated arsenal designs. However, I have seen students do worse than this by spending their assets poorly. So students should think carefully about what they want. Not having any missile defense is really not a good idea. Having too much of certain systems is not useful. But if you've got a very large neighbor, there are a lot of cheap systems like short-range aircraft. They're quite effective, or fixed IRBMs that provide a very cheap and heavy punch. So this is the overall distribution of adjacent and non-adjacent states. Short-range weapons can attack neighboring states, and long-range weapons are used for non-adjacent states. There's one missing relationship here, which is specified in the rules, but this is what I used to set up the blackboard before we play the simulation. Furthermore, you'll see that there are 3 boxes at the edge of every arrow. Those are conventional warfare fronts, and so different states can attack each other along these conventional fronts. China has 2 armies, and all the other states have 1 army. Actually, I believe India has 2 armies as well. And we'll cover the rules there here. So each state has a territorial dispute with each adjacent state. Each state has the ability to force an offensive in a single territorial dispute, except China, which has 2 offensive, and I believe India as well. Each territorial dispute has 6 consecutive spaces, 3 spaces on one state side and 3 on the other. A maximum of 1 offensive point may be assigned to a territorial dispute. If there's no opposing offensive, then an offensive marker advances a single space that turn, for a maximum of 1 space per turn. And if you advance, of course, over 3 consecutive turns, you conquer that territory. 2 offensives opposite each other lead to a stalemate, with the incumbent defender moving first. A state that captures all of a disputed territory inflicts 5 catastrophe points on the losing state, which basically is taken away from their collapse values. A state that has been decapitated 3 times or has collapsed loses all its offensives. Once a territorial dispute has been captured, the territory does not need to be garrisoned, so the army may be used elsewhere, and the losing state may not counterattack to recapture the territory. State armies are deployed before the completion of any movement. So decapitation attacks, they're pretty much similar to the Cold War simulation. Every decapitation attack specified as such in the orders will result from a maximum of 1 per turn, the reduction by half of that state's ability to launch. Once a state has received 3 consecutive decapitation attacks, where all the leaders are decapitated, whichever occurs first, that state proceeds automatically to its PSYOP. But of course, the PSYOP won't work if the state's collapsed. So the PSYOPs are, again, very similar to the PSYOPs of the Cold War simulation. Each state leader must submit a PSYOP. The leader may not invoke a PSYOP voluntarily. So this is unlike the Cold War simulation. The PSYOPs are invoked automatically if there's a decapitation of all the leaders. PSYOP launches permit doubling missiles and aircraft to be launched a turn and is unaffected by prior decapitation attack penalties. Once a PSYOP is invoked, it may not be turned off, and any weapons it does not launch may never be launched. The exception, of course, are submarines, which can be launched from purgatory. Students must declare which PSYOP is in use when the PSYOP is activated. So I allow players to have multiple PSYOPs, and they basically throw the one. Once they've judged a crystallization of who their enemy is, they then give me the appropriate PSYOP. Again, how is victory determined? Well, we basically just stare at the board where we have a map of the relevant countries and a lot of mushroom clouds.